Hello fellow woodworkers, welcome to this week's edition of the Garage Workshop from my new workshop location. This week we're going to be seeing if we can make a cross-cut sled with rails printed on a 3D printer. Let's get started. So this is the cross-cut sled that I made in an earlier video on the Garage Workshop. Normally I'd put a link and say watch it here, but I'm not going to this time because I've never been very happy with this sled. In fact, I probably only used it about 4 or 5 times, and the entire reason that I made it was I was building projects at the time that required it, and the miter saw one the miter gauge sort of one that comes with the table saw, to be honest, is really not good. It's very rickety. There's far too much movement in the rails and it's just not great. So I made this and I made 2 fatal mistakes. The first one was the wood I used. It was from a recycled kitchen unit, but it weighs an absolute ton. Now you want a bit of weight on a cross-cut sled to make it easy to slide it back and forward, to use the momentum in the weight of the wood. But I've weighed this and it's nearly 4 pounds in weight, which is quite a significant amount of weight. The second mistake that I made, I used these wooden rails. Now, generally that's fine to use, but this wood in particular, it's a very soft wood. I think it's actually pine if I remember. And over the course of the winter, when it's got a bit damp in the Garage Workshop, these have swollen slightly, and now it means it doesn't run accurately up and down. In fact, to get it to run up and down just before I made this video, I had to take the hand sander to it to sand a little bit off. So not really my greatest build. The other thing is, I just don't need one this big. I made this finger jig earlier on, and this one I will put a link to, and this size is absolutely perfect for most of what I want to do. Now, obviously, this has got angles on it, and I'm not saying I'm going to replicate this exactly, but I honestly don't believe in a cross-cut sled you need all of this depth of. And when you see other people on YouTube using cross-cut sleds, they never really seem to use the whole sled. I've never seen anyone put a slab of wood in that big and cut it. And I know that that's potentially what it's for, but for me, I don't think I need that. So I'm going to make an improved version of this sled, not quite as long. And for the rails, I'm going to use these. Now, these are printed on a 3D printer, and I've mentioned having access to a 3D printer in many of my videos before. I printed these out. I got them from a 3D printing site called Thingiverse, and I'll put a link to these. I didn't make these myself, somebody else did. But these have been created specifically to use as rails for a cross-cut sled like this. So we're going to see if I can make it using these, see how effective they are, and really whether there is a crossover between 3D printing and woodwork. So the first thing I'm going to do is just see if these fit together and see how straight they are. Okay, so I've got the rails here, and obviously they are designed, you can see hopefully from the end of that, they're designed to fit in like so. Now, I've just tried to put them together. Obviously that's upside down. I've just tried to put them together, and there is about a 2mm gap between the two. Now, if you're not experienced with using 3D printers, quite often when you make things on 3D printers, you do get a little bit of extra PLA, which is the stuff you use, which means that things don't go together 100%. If I sort of lay it on the top, I'm literally a couple of mil out, and I can see at the bottom there's a slight ridge on the base of that one. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. There's a little slight ridge on there which will need to come off, and actually in this one it actually looks pretty good, but there's a couple of little bits of overlapped print out there which are stopping it from stick together. So not perfect, but not awful. And on the second one, exactly the same thing. So I've got the same amount, the same gap on both of them. In terms of being straight, obviously it's hard to see, but if they are connected, then they are likely, I'm just looking at how straight, yeah, they're pretty good, they're pretty straight. So I'm able to use them to connect together. And as you can see, I've only printed out 4 of these. I haven't gone for a really, really long strip because the cross-cut sled that I'm going to make, I want to make about this size. And the other thing is, this is quite forgiving, these printed plastics. So if I was to tape or double-side tape a straight edge onto the piece of wood, I can butt these up against it and they'll sort of bring themselves in. Because it's plastic, and although it's hard, there's a little bit of flex in it. So what I'm going to do is just get a file and just take some of this off, just to make sure that we've got no extra plastic which is stopping them from sticking together. And then I'm going to see what they look like and how close they are. So let's do that now.
So the first thing I did was just get the file. I've got a couple of little files in a file set that I got from Screwfix quite a while ago, which are really handy actually, all different shapes and sizes. And then the bigger one you can see there is from a recent Parkside special, but it was a set. It's more of a rasp than a file, really, a detail file. But when I'd done that, I got them together, and as you can see, although there was still a little bit of a gap, it was much reduced. I just knocked off a tiny little bit at the end and we were good to go. In terms of them joining together. The gap is fine, they can still join straight.
Okay, so for this, I've got this piece of, it's an offcut that I got from B&Q. I think this had a bigger piece on the bottom of it, and it was only £2, I think. Let me check. Yeah, £2. So I've got a piece now. This is wide enough in terms of how much wider I want it to be, and it just about fits the rails. Now the rails aren't going to sort of protrude. It's almost exactly the correct size, so it's a good size. It matches the criteria. It's 12mm thick, but the other reason that I'm using this is it still has the original factory edge on one side, and it has the edge this side that was cut with the big cutting machine at B&Q. So in terms of both bits, it matches exactly what I need it to be. To stick these on and to get these in exactly the right place, I'm going to use a piece of wood. I'm going to use my angle square, and I'm going to put some marks on. I'm going to do some measurements now to get the exact places. Use this to put these on so that they're nice and straight. Then I'm going to pre-drill the pilot holes. Obviously, being MDF, I'm going to pre-drill everything, because you know what happens with MDF. If you don't, it ends up splitting. So I'm going to do some measuring now, make sure I get these in exactly the right position. Then before I fix them, I'm then going to go for the back part of the cross-cut sled. So let's start measuring, let's start marking and pre-drilling now.
So I took my time here when I was doing the marking out, and I wanted to find sort of exactly in the middle, and it didn't occur to me until right at the end that of course I could use the previous rails on my previous cross-cut sled as a guide, which is what I ended up using, but it was handy to have the measurements so that I had something to refer back to if I needed it later in the build.
Okay, so I've just had a measure up, and the width of this is 62 centimeters, and if I hold it against the width of my cross-cut sled, as if by magic, complete fluke, it's almost identical in terms of the size. It's probably only a couple, 1 or 2 mil shorter than this. So what I'm going to do is use this older one as just to give me a little bit of a rough guide, a rough template for where these are going to sit. And then what I'm going to do is fix them on with a piece of double-sided tape just to make sure they're in the right place. Then I'm going to offer them up to the table saw, just make sure they fit before I mark them permanently. So I'm just going to lay this on the top now, get a rough idea of where these rails are going to sit, both front and back, and then we'll take it from there.
So really simple marking up here. I just popped a clamp in at the top to try and see if that would steady it, but to be honest with you, it actually made it a lot worse. It was much more difficult because it meant I had to hold it at the bottom. But when I got it lined up, I just took my pencil and marked either side of the rail on the sort of inside of the board, and then that gave me some measurements that I could then put my set square on to draw out the line so that I could make sure it was all nice and straight. So I just lined the set square up with the marks, drew 2 set of two sets of parallel lines, and then when I was happy within them, I just offered back up the rails, making sure they were the right way round, and just then marked out the 3 holes I needed to pre-drill. I decided against using the double-sided tape here and just went straight for the drilling. I just thought it was easier in the long run. So I really took my time here, and it's interesting actually, because as you'll see from that, the drill bit is on quite an angle, and for me, I was being really careful that I was keeping the drill bit as high up as possible, but clearly you can see from that it wasn't. It was on an angle, and it's interesting sometimes when you video yourself doing things like this, you only pick up on stuff like that. So there's another potential project there about making some sort of device that keeps the drill straight, which I'll look into doing. But I drilled in literally probably 4 mil, not very deep at all, just to make sure I had somewhere for the screws to get started. So I just attached the rail using some screws, and unbeknown to me, this was the first of a couple of mistakes I made. You can see the screws there just clearly aren't deep enough. They only went into the material by about 2 mil, and later on I actually replaced all the screws because I just wasn't happy with the movement I was getting from them. So when I was satisfied that they were in and they were ready to go, I just popped the screws in, and then I just popped them out so I could continue working with the rail. But I did notice the screws were too short, far too short. I did then pick a longer screw and just attached it. I didn't use my driver for this. I just used a manual screwdriver just because I didn't want to sort of force it too far into the MDF or risk it splitting even more than it probably could do. When I was happy with the first rail, I just literally repeated the process on the other one, just attached it in the identical way to make sure it fitted perfectly. The next stage was to get the table saw out, offer up the rail on the bottom of the sled and see how it looked. So that was what I did next. Now I've got much more space in the workshop. It's easier to get the table saw out. I was a little bit nervous offering this up for the first time. I'm not going to lie. I was just a bit worried it might not fit and it might be a disaster. And obviously when I'd lowered the blade, you can see there is a gap, which I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, the 2 rails went on really well. I just got my set square out, and then I used the rail on the right hand side just to check how straight it was, but it actually was moving a lot more freely than perhaps the video looks. There was one little bit it was getting a bit caught on, but I was happy with how it turned out. Okay, so as you can see, it's very well matched at the bottom. It's actually flush all the way along, and if I just show you the edge, this is butted up against my stop there. It's actually really good. It's really straight, and when I put the set square up against it, again exactly the same thing. So really plumb, really pleased about that. The only disadvantage that I can see is if you look down here, there is quite a gap between the depth of this and the actual board. Now it is still, you know, pretty buoyant, but there's got to be getting on probably for a 5 mil gap between the two. Now I've got 2 ways that I can cure this problem. I can leave it and just accept it is the way it is, or I can potentially reprint out the rails but just reduce them. So I'm going to have a little think about that. But at the moment, very happy with at least how straight it is. Okay, so as you will just have seen, it's very much in line. It's really plumb with both the side and the bottom, which I'm really surprised about. It glides up and down freely. I mean, the plastic is going to need some sort of wax or something on it because it's not moving completely easy. But the good thing is the rails are moving perfectly in the rail guides. I think the stiffness that you can see is more related to the fact that the plastic is rubbing on the metal, and there's nothing really to sort of lubricate its movement forward. So I've just been having a think about whether I want to take the rails off and potentially print new ones and put them on the bottom ones that are thinner. I've just measured it. There's actually a 4 mil
gap between here and here. Now, I'm going to do something probably which might sound a bit odd, but I'm actually going to leave that gap in. It really doesn't bother me in any way, shape or form. And if I printed out some more rails, there's no guarantee at all that I would get them in the same tolerances, because as good as 3D printing is, and I think it's got some fantastic applications, everything I print always seems to be slightly different, only minimal amounts, but I can live with this being a little bit higher. All it means is I've got to raise the blade a little bit more. If it was something I was using all the time, like every day or 2 or 3 times a week, I would definitely change it. But for the amount of use this is going to get in the garage workshop, I'm not really bothered. And to be honest, it's such a nice fit, I don't want to risk taking everything off and putting it all back on again. Now, I have got another choice. I could attach some wood to the bottom of it to make a sort of spacer, to make this a little bit thicker. So what I'm going to do is have a look, see if I've got some wood that I can do that with. I'm not sure I have. If I have, I'll put it on, and if I haven't, I'm just going to fix the other 2 rails, and then I can begin putting the mounting on. Now, one other little thing, I've got a section of T-track that came off of the last cross sled that I made, and again, it's pretty much almost exactly the same size, so it is going to allow me to put a stop block in, because one of the limitations of my other sliding crosscut sled was, although I put this in, it was really limited in terms of stop block. Now this one will accept a stop block, and I've got one. I just need to see if I can sort of get it to work, but if not, I might go back to the 3D printer, because I know there are some crosscut sled stop block designs on it. So let me have a look, see if I've got the wood. If not, I'm just going to go ahead and fix the rails.
So having had a look, I didn't have any wood that I thought would go underneath any board, not a big enough piece, and then I did think I'd have to attach it, and it all got a bit messy, so I abandoned that idea. I then went on to making the sort of front and back. I've got this piece of MDF, slightly thicker. I actually think this is 20mm, this piece. But I got it, it was very, very uneven on both ends, so I just ran it through the table saw, got a straight edge on both sides, and then I measured it, and I went for a sort of 3/4 or 2/3, 1/3 mix of it. So obviously I had exactly the same piece, but you'll see at the end one is slightly smaller than the other. So I've got the rail, the one that you're going to hold and push that the rail's going to go on. I've got that closer, and then the smaller piece at the end. The next stage was to offer up the pieces of cut wood. You can just about see there a slight difference. The one that's lying on the bench is obviously smaller. I just wanted to sort of test fit them really. There was a little bit of an overhang on the edge which I could have taken off, but to be honest I didn't really want to do that. I then got the tight bond out. Luckily it's been a little bit warmer over in the UK, and the glue was able to dry. So I spread it. I probably put a little bit too much glue on, because I had quite a lot of squeeze out when I'd done this, which I had to sort of wipe off. But it was nice and straight. I just used the other piece of wood there to butt it up to make sure it's 100% straight, which it was. And when I did that, I went and got my handy weights, bought on sale in Aldi, to just weight it down and give it enough time so it could dry. It didn't take too long, a couple of hours, it was done. I then took the weights off, and it stuck really well. I just popped a couple of clamps on, which would enable me to sort of flip the unit up and start pre-drilling underneath, which was the next thing I did. I made my second mistake here again. Screws I used just weren't long enough, but we'll come back to that later. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, everything I did I pre-drilled. So here I just made enough room for the screw heads. I did the screw. And as I said, you'll see later, didn't pick the biggest screws. I should have picked much bigger ones, and I corrected that later on when I cut the table saw, when I cut the hole in the crosscut sled. So I just took them all up, pre-drilled, got the holes in exactly the right places. Then I just hollowed out a little bit to get the screw head in so it sat flush, and just repeated it. I just attached it in 4 places on the bottom. I thought that was enough, but clearly it was enough, but obviously not enough in terms of length of screws, but we'll talk about that a bit later on in the video. Having done that, I just literally replicated the same thing on the other side, glued it, waited for it to dry, and then pre-drilled and screwed all of the holes in as I'd done before. The next stage was to attach the T-track, and I was really careful how I pre-drilled these holes. So I just softened it up, marked out the screw holes, and when I drilled these holes I did them quite a bit deeper than I'd done the other one, because obviously I wanted to use a deeper screw, a longer screw for this bit. I realised watching the video back, I did this in a slightly odd way. So what I did was connected sort of either end. I hadn't pre-drilled the holes in the middle. I don't think I'd done anyway. So I pre-drilled either end, and then yeah, you can see it was slightly off centre. I think the first time I had too much metal hanging off one end and not the other. So when I was happy, screwed one in, made sure it was flush, did the same at the other end, and then I drilled the screw holes straight in, pre-drilled them straight in, and then drove the screws home. I sort of slightly did it the other way round, but to be honest with you, it worked for me, and the actual rail is completely flush with that piece of wood, and I was very happy with it. The only problem was the stop block that I had bought for it didn't work, but I think that's an easy enough thing to correct. So by this stage, I was confident enough that I just went for it. So I got a piece of wood to keep a nice straight edge. This is, again, a bit with a factory edge cut on it that I know is straight. Pre-drilled, followed exactly the same procedure for both, and attached it. And to be fair, the actual attached rail was pretty good. You'll see in a minute. I need a little bit of sort of fettling here and there to get it to run perfectly straight, but attaching it was very, very straightforward, and it looked to the eye nice and straight, and obviously butted up against the piece of wood. It was straight butted against that as well. So I was pretty sure they were as straight as they could be at this stage, but again, something like this is going to need a bit of working to make sure it's as straight as it could be, which is obviously key in this type of crosscut sled. So then I offered it up, and as you can see, it was slightly off on one side. You can see as you're looking at the screen, the left-hand side was up, and that rail just needed a slight adjustment, which I did off camera. Obviously, you didn't want to see me doing all that, but pretty much it was good. It was just that left-hand rail was sat sort of in for most, but then just lifted out at the end. So I just took it off and adjusted that. So I then began the process of raising the blade to cut the, you know, the sort of slit for the blade. And you'll see here, I put the weights on just to help. Here, as it goes through, the back wood just catches the riving knife at the back, and you'll see the whole back bit bends forward just there. Obviously, I felt that at the time. You can see me straightening it up. And what was clear was those screws just weren't big enough. So I lowered the blade. I'd already got it sort of through the first section, and then I was quite easily able to complete the cut, and it was moving nice and smoothly all the way through from front to back.
Okay, so the crosscut sled is finished, as you will have just seen. I've made the cut down the side. Now, it does move freely pretty much. There's a tiny little bit of resistance just at the beginning, but as you can see, it's good enough for moving in and out. Now, you will have seen probably in the video, as I was cutting the centre blade, this whole section here slightly leaned forward. I think it's because the screws I used were far too small. I think I only used sort of 25mm screws, so I've just reinforced them. I've just taken the screws out. I did it off camera, and I've just put more substantial screws in. And while I was at it, I did the ones at the back just to be sure. Now, unfortunately, my angle, the stop that I had doesn't work. It sort of is designed to go the other way, and it's actually too wide to fit in the T-track. So I am going to make one on the 3D printer, because I think it's the only thing that's missing. And of all of the crosscut sleds I've made, as I said, I think this is the third one. This is the one that I'm happiest with. I think it's, you know, met the brief of being smaller, being much more useful. It's certainly a lot more compact. It's certainly a lot lighter than my other attempts, and it works. And the 3D printed rails were a success. Now, it did take a little bit of finagling to get them to fit, and that's partly because this one, and I didn't realise it until I put it in, is slightly bowed. So I had the option of sanding it down or just slightly altering the position of the screws, which is ultimately what I decided to do. I just thought it was much easier to do it that way. So Am I pleased with it? Yes. Am I impressed with it? Yes, I am impressed with it, to be fair. It's turned out exactly as I wanted and hoped it would. And of course, the most important thing is I now have a functional cross-cut sled. And interestingly, since I resat the rails, I'm not sure if you can see, the gap between the bottom of the wood and the actual bench, the sort of table saw, has massively reduced. It's literally only a couple of mil now, so very happy with that. If this is your first time at the Garage Workshop, thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. It really helps the YouTube algorithm. I've got loads of back videos now, and I produce a video every week of some description, so please make sure you do that. If you are a regular follower, thank you so much. The last couple of videos have been really popular with you guys, nearly 500 views on my last one, so thanks for the ongoing support. Please don't forget to like and comment as well, and also don't forget to share the channel. If you're in other channels or you know anyone who's interested in woodworking, please send them to the channel. It'd be great to get to 1,000. That's it for this week's video on the Garage Workshop. I'll catch you all next week. Happy woodworking.